I want to thank Stephen Crawford for that nice introduction. It's always humbling to sit in an audience and listen to somebody say nice things about you. And Steve, I really appreciate what you had to say. And most of it's true. 10 years ago, I sat in the audience like you are tonight as Don Koosmal was inducted as president of AASA. I never dreamed that 10 years later I would be standing in front of another another meeting of the governing board and executive committee and being installed as president of this great organization. Almost 149 years ago, in August of 1865, a group of school superintendents who were attending the National Teachers Association meeting in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is about 125 miles to our north, met and decided that that there should be a National Superintendents Organization. That organization, which we know today as AASA, those group of superintendents decided to hold a national convention in February of 1866 in Washington, D.C. In February, while we were meeting in Nashville, I talked about that first meeting and some of the challenges those superintendents faced and the issues that they were dealing with. Today I want to talk to you about a different time period in American history. I want to talk to you about a time period between 1825 and 1850, a time that one author described as so divisive that friendships were lost, business partnerships were dissolved, church congregations argued with each other and argued with their clergy about an issue that was so divisive that politicians stayed away from it at all cost. Now, typically when you talk about the time period between 1825 and 1850 and use a divisive political issue, the topic that we're talking about is slavery. But this issue is something different. It was the fight for tax-supported, publicly controlled, non-sectarian education, what we know today as public schools. You know, this time last year, I could not have talked to you very much about the history of public education in this country. It wasn't until I started to do my research for my speech in February on the history of AASA that I really, for the first time, began to look at the history of public education in this country. I mean, I had a general knowledge, probably like most of you in the audience. I knew that education had been important in the to the early settlers of this country, that especially in the colonies in the northeastern part of the country, Massachusetts, Connecticut, that there had been a school movement. That school movement eventually led to decisions and the passage of laws that required the assessment of taxes to support schools, and that those schools primarily were church schools. And so we had a kind of a mixture of public support and parochial education. And then I knew that in the mid-1800s that Massachusetts passed legislation that put some requirements on mandatory attendance, and that under the direction of Horace Mann, their school system evolved into really what is the model of public education in the United States today. What I could not tell you was that that wasn't just an easy thing to happen. That it was a time there was lots of public debate about public schools. I would not have been able to tell you that the early supporters of public education were considered to be radicals, and they were considered to be dangerous to the state. I could not have told you that it wasn't until political organizations were formed that at that time were called propaganda societies in support of public education did the idea of public schools really begin to take hold. These organizations, which were formed in New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut, met in their states. They held conventions, they held rallies, they wrote papers, and they traveled their states in support of public education. making the case that public schools were critical to the future of our country. And they lobbied their legislatures and they lobbied their governors until they were able to convince either enough members of the legislature or in some cases enough members of the public to, when votes were held, to support the establishment of tax-supported, government-controlled, non-sectarian schools. Now, I'm sure some of you are sitting out there and you're saying, well, that's a great history lesson. I'm glad to know that. But we have our own issues that we have to deal with in our states today. And that's very true. If your state is like Oklahoma, you have those in your state who believe that they shouldn't have to pay taxes to support public schools because they don't have children in school any longer. We have those in Oklahoma who believe that parents should have ultimate say on a child's education, and that local school boards, State Department of Education, state legislature should have no say, no control, no voice in education, in the decisions that a parent makes. We have those who believe that we just can't afford to have high-quality public schools in our state today, that our economy can't afford it, our state can't afford it. And then we have those who believe that we should somehow level the playing field, and that we should be able to use tax dollars to support not only public schools, but parochial schools and private schools. What's interesting about those arguments is those are the exact same arguments that were made by those in the early 1800s to oppose the formation of public schools. You know, it's interesting that as Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 1:9, there really is nothing new under the sun. You know, the question we have before us today is, who is going to be the advocates for public education in America? Who are going to be the ones that work with parents, teachers, community members to rebuild support for public schools? You know, if your state's like mine, what we have found is that it's not so much that public education has lost its support, it's just that it's so common that nobody feels that there's really any challenge to public education. And what we found this year in Oklahoma is that there is strong support for our public schools. In fact, in March of this year, we had a rally, and we had 30,000 people show up at the state capitol of Oklahoma City to voice their support for public education. And I personally believe that we're going to have to see these kind of events all across our country to really drive home to those that are our elected officials that our public wants strong public schools. We're fortunate in that in addition to parents and teachers and community members, we also have strong organizations that are ready to support superintendents as we drive this discussion. In Oklahoma, our state association was a very big part of our state rally. And obviously AASA is a strong supporter of public education on the national level. You know, one of the questions that I had as I did my research was, with such strong public sentiment in the beginning against public education, how did the supporters of public education carry the day? Obviously they worked very hard, but I think that the main reason that they won is because they had the best arguments. And I want to share one of those arguments with you tonight. And that argument was that the free and general education of all children at public expense is the natural right of all children in a republic. You know, that statement was true in the early 1800s. It was true as our public education system developed in this country. It was true in 1854 when the Supreme Court ruled that separate schools were inherently unequal. It was true in 1974 when Congress passed Public Law 94-142, which we know today as IDEA. And it's true today as we try to provide a quality education to all children, regardless of race, national origin, sex, sexual preference, or immigration status. The right that the free and general education of all children at public expense is the natural right of all children that are born in a republic. You know, we don't use the words natural right very much in our country today. But in the early 1800s, that was a powerful statement. Our founding fathers were well versed in the idea of natural rights. That concept had been developed by John Locke in his Second Treatise of Government, which is what really the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are based on. A natural right is what Thomas Jefferson referred to in the Declaration of Independence as an inalienable right. And that's a right that belongs to everyone just by virtue of being alive. Jefferson identified the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as belonging to all people regardless of the form of government that they had. So what the supporters of public education were arguing was that with our decision to form a Republican form of government, that a free public education then became a natural right of all children who lived in that republic. I think that argument is still viable today. And I think it's a strong argument that in a republic that our children have a natural right to a public education. In closing, I want to thank Amy for her service this past year as president of AASA. She is definitely going to be a tough act to follow. I want to thank all of you who are in attendance tonight for your willingness to serve on the governing board and executive committee of AASA. The work you do for all superintendents in America is important. I want to thank Dan for his leadership. You know, one of the not a problem, but one of the effects of our governance structure is that our leadership, because of the way our system works, we don't have a lot of institutional knowledge on our governing board and executive committee. And I just want those who are new members of the governing board and executive committee to know that we're in the position we are today in AASA because of Dan Dominich's leadership. You know, like every other national organization, our organization stood on the brink with the beginning of the Great Recession. AASA survived. We are stronger. We are not only today the leading voice of superintendents in Washington, D.C. and nationally, but now we are the leading voice of public education. And we owe that to Dan and his team. And Dan, I want to thank you again for that. Thank you for being here this evening. I look forward to serving you as president of AASA this next year. And I want you to know that, that my mission is to build support for public education across this country. In any way that I can do that and help you in your state, just please let me know and I'll do whatever I can. Thank you and good night.